Okay, so let's try to answer that question again. What has been the resistance to ecology? Where has this resistance come from? But rather than just looking at some reasons like in recent years, let's go through 2,000 years of history. Let's look at it from these 2,000 years since Christ came and walked among us to see. So here's what I did. I did lots of research to find saints that had a special relationship to the environment. I found about 100. And then I put them on a timeline. So every dot you see there was a saint I found. And after putting them on there, I just sat there and I looked. What I'm telling you, I haven't read this anywhere. I think this should be part of some research in theology by someone eventually, because I think it's a really interesting topic. I haven't seen this anywhere. So this comes from me, and this is my personal analysis, my hypothesis that I'm sharing with you. So here it goes. I find all these saints, I put them on a timeline. This is what happens. So I ask myself, what are those gaps for? What do they mean? So first one, the Crusades. Okay, middle of the Middle Ages, and what are the Crusades all about? Well, you have a bunch of people thinking that their religion and their way of thinking is valid, and the rest of the people are so invalid that they can die. Let's go kill off the other people that don't believe like we do. Okay? That is such a huge disrespect for life that, for me, obviously, you're not going to recognize saints that are taking care of other creatures and have a special relationship with nature. Because there's this social context, cultural context that is just poisoning the way people look at each other and look at nature. So that's my hypothesis. The Crusades and that whole idea of going to kill other people, that just didn't work well. Okay? Then we move into the Renaissance. Now you might tell me, how come? During the Renaissance, we find all kinds of sculptures and paintings about nature. So how come the Renaissance we wouldn't find any saints? Well, actually, when you really look at the paintings and this whole movement, it was a type of auto-glorification, self-glorification of humans, of humanity just being so much more elevated from the rest of creation that obviously we would just laugh at people who would be consciously taking care of it. So that didn't work. And then all of a sudden we see a few more appear after the Renaissance. And those ones, quite a few, are actually natives. So they come from a culture where they would take care of the environment. They would have a special relationship with the environment. So then they converted to Christianity, but actually brought a bit of that with them. So we find a few more. And then after that, for the past 300 years, there's at least two reasons why we haven't been taken care. Two reasons why we won't find saints, and it hasn't been in our Christian culture. It's been colonization and industrialization. Now, colonization, we think that some groups of humans are more important than other groups of humans. And actually, the main thing about colonization, when it comes to the environment, is that you come with a flag and plant it and declare ownership of it. And it's this sense of ownership that really brings this idea that, well, I can destroy it if I want because it's mine. and not submitting to this, to the balances that are there. There's no sense of that. And then industrialization, I mean, that's a few steps further where, everything is just an object to be exploited and then put into the market. So the more you destroy, well, the more resources you have in your hands to be distributed and to sell and to make money and to create wealth. So there you go. And in that context, well, even though there are men and women who are turning towards God and taking care of creation, that's not viewed as a virtue. Okay? So that's just a quick history of all of those. When we ask, has the church been taking care of the environment? Historically, people don't even know that we had all these great periods. We mostly concentrate on the last 300. And why? Well, I found that reason in a wonderful book from Jean Baster. There's even a research chair in his honor. He passed away a few years ago. And so he wrote this book in French, Pour une écologie chrétienne, an amazing book. And it was my first book I read on Christian ecology, and it was just splendid. And yeah, I had the chance to meet him in 2008 and give a joint presentation, a joint talk with him. I have great admiration. In his book, Pour une écologie chrétienne, he describes two people that had a huge influence on philosophy, and then that got into theology after that. So the first one was Francis Bacon. And he says this expression that just still resonates today: knowledge is power. Now, although that seems to make sense in our minds today, and it's still like a driving force, it's actually not faithful to the Bible or to the Christian tradition to that point. Because when you think of, who had the most wisdom in the Bible? Solomon. And Solomon is described to have been able to identify, thousands of plants and animals and birds, and he was able to name the things around him. He had knowledge of his surroundings, of his natural environment, hence it made him wise. There was this idea, just like Jesus, contemplating nature and then coming back in front of a group and saying parables about nature, is that nature holds so much wisdom. So the knowledge of your natural environment was going to lead you towards wisdom. That's what's in the Bible. That's what was in cultures up to that point. And then Francis Bacon goes and says, knowledge is power. Which we can apply to certain contexts, but when it comes to the natural environment, it's a huge problem. It means that I don't need to know the names of all the different trees unless I intend to go cut them, to have power over them. I don't need to know all the names of the fish in the sea or in the river close to where I live. I don't need to know that unless I intend to go fish them out, to have power over them. Okay? So that was a huge historical cut in the way we conceived knowledge. Knowledge now brings us power, but before knowledge could bring us wisdom. Okay? He also was the first to introduce the experimental method. And obviously, it's a revolution in the mind to say that, okay, nature is not a subject to be in relation with. It's an object to manipulate. Okay, here's another guy, René Descartes. You've probably heard of Cartesian thought. It's very logical. And he said this, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Okay, so basically I exist because I'm able to think, which means that other things don't have the same value. Other living things around me can't think, so they don't have the same value. And he wrote his most important book, Discourse on the Method. And he writes this: an animal is but a clock composed of wheels and springs. He goes on to say that if you're hurting an animal and it screams, it's not actually in pain. It's just the wheels and springs that are reacting. So, for really considering every creature as an object and not, as Francis of Assisi and many others, as a subject, as something to relate to, there was this huge cut. And then it gives us all the problems we've seen of a lot of arrogance towards nature and just rereading the Bible in a certain way. Because here's a very well-known passage. Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and have dominion. Submit the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and the animals on earth. So, before Francis Bacon and René Descartes, to read this passage simply meant to do faithful agriculture. To have dominion on the earth, which meant to plow, and to cut down trees to have a field. And to submit the fish and the birds and the animals, well, it's to have livestock and, to go fishing and everything. But it was done like agriculture has been done, around the planet for thousands of years, with a certain respect of nature. But now, with the Cartesian's thought and saying knowledge is power, and then colonization and industrialization, we reread this passage and we think it's the permission to go destroy everything as we want. It obviously makes no sense and it's not very wise. So I hope you liked this little visit of the past 2,000 years to really revisit how the church has been very close to nature in many, and we could say most, of Christian history, and try to find out why it hasn't been the case in the past 300 years. And that maybe now we're starting a new generation of saints who are close to nature.